On July 22nd, 2021, a group of women won a case against the government of Czechoslovakia after years of hard campaigning. What were they campaigning against? This is Ingrid Genyova, one of the countless young Romani women who have been forcefully sterilized by the Slovakian government between 1966 and 2012.
Chcem, aby sa každý dozvedel, čo som ja, môjmu dieťaťu, že mohla som mať tú radosť a tú bolesť.
Ingrid's local hospital did this to her when she was only 16. Like her, many Romani women have been fighting for generations against the slow and silent erasure of a historically marginalized people. A people who barely make it to most textbooks. In fact, an analytical report by the Roma Educational Fund found that only Germany had a considerable amount of mentions of the Roma people, perhaps due to their recent history of targeted hunting and systematic genocide of 1.5 million Roma. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. When wars rage across Europe time and time again, the Roma and Sinti people have had to evade capture in Europe, whether it be at the hands of the Nazis.
Europe, it was legal to hunt down and kill gypsies as if they were wild animals. In other countries, Roma were rounded up and exported as slave labor to colonies in the New World, including America.
Or even right now.
Eastern Europe's Roma communities have frequently been the victims of discrimination and prejudice. But in Ukraine, where war with Russian-backed separatists has heightened nationalist tensions, the surge in anti-Roma hate crimes threatens to spiral out of control. We've been to find out why.
They want to throw on us all the responsibility, but it was an operation of the police and the official authorities of this district. It was also very great manipulation when...
The C-14 attack inspired other attacks across the country, like this one by National Corps, which they streamed live on the internet.
600 человек вам станет вот такой вот жирный лайк.
The apparent impunity of those who participate in these crimes has led to an exodus of Roma from Kiev.
Hi, I'm Rohan, and let's talk about a group of people that many European countries kind of wish didn't exist.
Цыгане или ромы – это часть общества. И всего лишь навсего их нужно научить жить по законам той страны, в которой они проживают. Все.
Welcome back. As we spoke about last time, racism against people of South Asian descent is not a new phenomenon. It's been a cycle of struggle and then amnesia for a very long time. Many folks in our own communities do not know that Romani people have South Asian descent or ancestry. Romani folks usually aren't included in discussions of diaspora. However, thanks to an easy access of information and South Asian folks educating themselves on the matter, there have been many recent calls to recognize the Roma people as a part of the South Asian diaspora. Romani creators like Florian and Indian creators like Abhinav in Search of the Lost have been doing some amazing work online to bring awareness to the similarities between our cultures and these histories that we rarely speak about. Shout out to Florian, by the way. I've been watching their content for a while now. If you're interested in Romani culture and history, please check out their channel after this. They are of the Calderaș ethnic group of Romania. My introduction and prompts to read more about Romani history have been through their work. Without their continuous work online, I would not have known where to start. The Roma and Sinti people left the regions of North India and modern-day Pakistan 1,000 years ago, perhaps around 500 AD, traveling through the Islamic world and into Europe by the 9th century. From Rajasthan to Egypt to Turkey to Andalusia in southern Spain, after which many were expelled to Mexico by the Catholic Church.
Pienso que el gitano ha aportado al flamenco bastante, ¿no? Bastante mucho. Y el gitano ha sido una persona muy sufrida, todos los aspectos, ¿no?
Today, there are many subgroups of Roma people across Europe and the world. The Kalderash of southeastern Europe, the Romani Chals of England, the Sinti in Germany, Italy, and France, Kale in Wales, Finland, Portugal, and Spain. The Roma people have a common language called Romanese. This language has many different dialects, many of which are secret. And this is because the Romani language has been key to the group's survival. It has been often used to share notes about how to evade capture and enslavement. The Roma are not Romanians, by the way. They have nothing to do with the country of Romania or the name of the country of the Romania. However, in the past, when Romania was the provinces of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania, these kingdoms were directly responsible for 500 years of chattel slavery of the Romani people. The name Roma is a Romani word that developed over time. Historians believe that the Rome part comes from the Dome castes of India, who were marginalized tribes of dancers and musicians. The very common G word is also a slur, so I will not be using it in this video. It's an exonym that represents a very outdated European idea that the Roma people came from Egypt, when in reality their roots trace back to the Indian subcontinent. Orientalist tropes that you might see in Disney movies to the bohemian aesthetic is directly ripped off from Romani culture. Hollywood has also profited off these stereotypes, while erasing Romani people from being protagonists in their own stories. Perhaps the most famous example being the Marvel character Scarlet Witch. Wanda Maximoff is a Jewish Romani woman in the comics. But in the universally popular MCU, she is neither Jewish nor Romani. She is instead cast as a white Romanian woman working with the Nazis. I don't think people understood just how bizarre this was when it came out. The Romani people have many other exonyms in Europe. Exonyms, by the way, are names given to a group without their choosing or consent. They are also often used in a derogatory manner. In Greece, the term atsinganoi was used to classify the Roma. The Germans use the term
Zigeuner,
Italians use the word
Zingari.
and the French referred to them as
Zigan.
The root for all these words translates to untouchable. The Romani were and still are social outcasts in Europe, despite living there for 1,000 years. They are subject to segregation when it comes to basic things like healthcare, schooling,
Just as soon as the white Slovaks leave the church, the wedding will begin.
and even visiting places of worship. The Romani would historically move from region to region to avoid persecution. Even today, centuries-old archaic stereotypes exist of Roma people being deceitful, lazy, and prone to stealing. Many European communities would also attribute traditionally anti-Semitic stereotypes to the Roma people, like stealing children. And it didn't matter that the Roma people are mostly Christian either. It just continues a long and frankly accepted history of pointing the finger at people who don't look like you or act like you. Racist rhetoric is not stagnant, it evolves over time. It tends to couch itself in terms used by those who resisted it in the past and adopts a new, more liberal face. Today, racism is often couched in economic rhetoric, fake populism, and justifications. Similarly, economic justifications were used to discriminate against the Romani people early on. Various Romani ethnic groups have had a long history of being experts in metalworking and other trades like basket weaving and making clothes, owing to their lineages of being descendants of Indian Jatis engaged in the same practices and occupations. This was seen as an economic threat by many European trading guilds. Deliberate economic discrimination and ostracization and exclusion from the traditional marketplaces would have caused many Romani young men and women to have to engage in petty theft for their survival. If you are forced to steal because you've intentionally been pushed out of the market because of prejudice, then stealing is the only option. The immorality of the system that allows a group to starve purely because of their lineage or color vastly outweighs the morality of the act of petty theft. This was the impoverished material reality created by many European societies who came into contact with Romani people. The effects of which many societies turned into racial stereotypes that exist to this day. Eastern Europe has a very long history of chattel slavery of Roma. The 20th of Feb marks 500 years of chattel slavery imposed on the Romani people. Note that this is not indentured servitude, this is chattel slavery. Indentured servitude involves entering into a contract to be indentured and has a term, while chattel slavery deems that you are a slave from birth. It is based on your birth and your bloodline as if you were livestock, and which means that your children would also be born slaves. This is pretty much erased from the consciousness of most people today. However, it is also important to remember that the Romani people are not a passive group or a passive monolith. They resisted in many ways that they could. They resisted in ways that inspire in the face of overwhelming odds. And that is a history that we can all learn from. There's a great paper on this by Adrian Nicolae Fortuna. I advise you to check it out if you'd like to dive deeper. To this day, even in academia, the Romani are often gaslit and portrayed as perpetual victims in many European accounts, especially when it comes to talking about chattel slavery within Europe and the denial of the Romani genocide during the Holocaust. An account well known to those aware of Romani history is the case of Rudarasa. Romani who were born in the provinces of Wallachia, Moldavia and Transylvania were born as slaves to the crown by default, if they were not owned by a boyar or noble family. In the case of Rudarasa, she was born to the crown initially but was later sold to a boyar or noble family, making her a property of that family. In 1843, when the Wallachian state officially freed state-owned slaves, Rudarasa, in a show of bravery, filed a lawsuit against her oppressor and argued that because she was originally born as a slave to the state, she argued that her 6 children and her must be set free from the family that owned her. This trial lasted more than 10 years. In fact, a local tribunal actually declared her a free woman in 1845. But the decision was appealed by the noble family who owned her, and this case was pushed to the appeals court, where it stayed for 10 years. Rudrasa fought for those 10 years, bringing forth multiple witnesses from her childhood that attested to the fact that yes, in fact, she was a state-owned slave. But their testimonies were dismissed based on the fact that, according to law at the time, a slave did not have the right to testify in court. Therefore, the appeals court reversed the decision to declare her a free woman. This did not stop Rudrasa. With the help of a lawyer, she took the case to the Supreme Court of Wallachia. The Supreme Court ruled that she was finally free from slavery in 1858. She had won. And she wasn't the only one. There were numerous other Roma folks who were fighting for their freedom in any way they could, in the face of a society who had learned that they were not human for 500 years. Most people around the world today know about the tale of Dracula and his real-life inspiration, Vlad the Impaler, who was also from the region. But what they don't usually know is Vlad the Impaler also owned 15,000 Romani slaves. They worked on his estates and worked for his army. Even during the Holocaust in Europe, many Romani resisted in different ways. The reality was the Nazis didn't just decide one fine morning to eradicate the Roma people and Jewish folks. What was happening was a bit deeper, some aspects of which we would be very familiar with today. In his article, Jason Dorsey outlines what he likes to call the Bavarian Precedent. The powers that came before the Nazis set the precedent for what would happen to the Roma folks during the Holocaust. Dorsey also writes about how, on one hand, the Roma were constantly misrepresented and marginalized. However, European society also had a fascination and they would fetishize aspects of Romani culture. As I touched upon in my video about caste and its intersection with colonialism, in the 1900s, European powers were obsessed with the idea of race science. The calipers came out only to justify the Europeans' rise to prominence and their place in the world stage. This was an era that saw the monolithization of broad swaths of the global south, including the ham-fisted grouping of thousands of Indian jatis and religions into the umbrella term of Hindu, which was an exclusionary racial term the British used to classify Indians who were not of the Abrahamic faiths. In this era of European enlightenment, when people were slotted and classified like animals in a biology textbook, the various ethnic tribes that made up the group we know as Romani today were also slotted into the term G-word. In Imperial Germany, generations of anti-Romani sentiment fused with modern race science, and the German state adopted new methods of policing and surveillance in order to keep the Romani in line. In the 1880s and 1890s, the newly unified Imperial Germany under the conservative Chancellor Otto von Bismarck saw the growth of enormous resentment towards the Sinti who had lived in Germany for generations. This was fueled by anti-immigrant sentiments because of Romani and Sinti folks who were moving into Germany from regions like Romania and Hungary. These Romani were often from formerly enslaved lineages and were very often darker skinned. They also had a different dialect, and like the many times before, the Bavarian authorities at the time passed strict rules around how Romani could perform trade, therefore intentionally hampering the communities financially. In 1885, the government swept up undocumented Romani, those who were not registered as citizens, and the incarcerated were forced to pay all legal fees, including the fees of their expulsion from the kingdom. In 1899, the police in Munich created a new office called the Central Office for Zigeuner Affairs. The director of this ridiculous use of taxpayer money, Alfred Dillman, set a precedent for surveillance and information gathering on the Romani people. Local police were ordered to interrogate every Romani person they found on the nature of their papers, their documents, even how many animals they traveled with, especially horses, from which direction they had come, and whether or not the police already had cases against them. Horses have a cultural significance to the Romani people, as they have helped provide sources of income when businesses would not hire Romani. They would also help them move camps very quickly in case of persecution. They were also seen as members of the family, members of the Roma Tabor. This is why the police targeted the horses. According to Dossi, Dillman took great pride in launching his book, Zigeuner Book. It listed a compendium of separate laws applicable specifically to the Roma people, and listed all the names of everyone they had interrogated, including how many animals they had and so on. Criminalization, according to the Germans, consisted of various activities like setting up camp, lighting a campfire, grazing your horse. Many other German states also thought that this was a great idea, and they soon followed suit. And after the British had designed and systematized the fingerprint system that they had used to police Indians in India, the Germans took those systems and implemented them on the Romani. Remember, we do not exist in a vacuum. States always share notes, so we should also. This body of information voraciously gathered by the German state and police on a specific ethnic group further helped to streamline the future waves of Romani persecution in Europe. They were branded an unassimilable race. The persecution of Romani continued through World War I and the German Revolution of 1918. In 1926, the Bavarian government enacted new laws combating the G-words, travelers, and the work shy. Newer licensing laws were created also to stifle further economic development and participation in the trade market. Just by existing, the Romani were criminalized. We haven't even got to the Nazis yet. when Hitler took power in 1933, they didn't really need to enact many new laws. The Bavarian government had already streamlined it for them. They had set the precedent. So when German libs complain about us bringing up Nazis all the time, they're kinda right. Because it goes way deeper than just the Nazis. The Nazis merely became custodians of a pre-existing problem. The Romani, like the Jewish folks, were banned from having firearms, while gun laws loosened for Nazi member parties later on. Roma were also not allowed to form large bands with caps put in place for the size of groups. And any Romani who was over the age of 18 and could not prove any form of traditional employment were forced into labor camps for 2 years. For some folks watching, this macro perspective might be a bit disconnected for some viewers to generate empathy. So let's zoom in and see how this would have impacted an individual. Say a bright young star who was at the peak of their game. Enter Johann Rukeli Trollmann, a Sinto-Romani boxer who became one of Germany's best light heavyweight champions. Rukeli began boxing when he was young and won several amateur boxing championships, making him one of the few prominent Romani faces in a predominantly and artificially white sport in Germany. You see, after the Nazis came into power, they ordered that all Jewish and Romani folks be removed from public competition. Only white Aryans were worthy enough to be seen fighting under the German flag. The boxer who held both middleweight and light heavyweight titles was Eric Seelig, and he was Jewish. Eric was stripped of his titles and forced to flee Germany, therefore leaving his spots vacant. The Germans could not have their dear Aryan youth be publicly defeated by a minority, especially a Jewish man at the time. However, Rukeli was a different case. He was up and coming. He had not yet been a champion on a large stage. He had won most of his bouts and developed a fan base around his unique fighting style. So he was allowed to continue boxing as a test for the up-and-coming young white fighters, some of which were part of the Nazi party. Kind of like the beast that needed to be defeated so the young Nazis would come of age. He was so good that for a time even the Nazis could not deny his place in the ring. Right-wing media at the time would print cartoons of Rukeli having distorted facial features and portraying him as arrogant and sneaky. People would make fun of his fighting style, calling it Ziegener-Tanz, meaning G-word dance. In 1933, a high-profile fight was set up between Rukeli and the so-called Aryan fighter Adolf Witt. To the dismay of the Nazis, Rukeli ended up dominating Adolf on the stage and earning an easy victory. The Nazi judges tried to call for a no decision. However, the crowd started to get quite rowdy and it became clear that this was going to lead to a riot. So the judges were forced to award Rukeli with the title of light heavyweight champion. This victory at the pinnacle of German boxing at the time was very short-lived. Just a few days later, the merit-loving and very fair German Boxing Association sent Rukeli a letter saying that he had been stripped of his championship and title, stating in the letter that because he danced like a G-word, that it was not proper German boxing. They also threatened to revoke his boxing license if he did not fight his next fight in a proper German boxing style. So what did Brother Rukeli do? He accepted the next fight and stepped into the ring with his hair dyed blonde and his face overly powdered with white, making a mockery of the ideal Aryan in front of the Nazis. He then stood still and stiff as his opponent beat him down and finally knocked him out in the 5th round. Truly living up to his name, Trollmann. This direct mockery and protest of white supremacy would signal the end of his career though. He had realized that even though he had dedicated his life to being the best light heavyweight in Germany, and he'd won fair and square, it didn't matter. Because in Germany at the time, it was about fairness, but just the fairness of your complexion, not moral fairness. Rukeli was then targeted by the Germans for forced sterilization, so he could not have any more children. He was among the many Romani people who had undergone forced sterilization and could not have any more children. You will find that this is a common theme among many stories of the Romani people across Europe, not just Germany. He divorced his wife and left his daughter as well, and changed their names to avoid them from being persecuted. I'm shortening the story for brevity, but he was arrested later in a different city and sent to slave away at a labor camp. At the labor camp, he was quickly recognized as the famous boxer Rukeli and forced to instruct the German guards on boxing even after his 12-hour-long shift, slaving away for Germany's imperial desires. He lost 30 kilos and began to waste away, so his fellow campmates decided to declare him dead. They changed his name and worked to shifting him to another camp so he could avoid further persecution from the guards who were just exploiting him. However, upon reaching the next camp, Rukeli was again recognized and forced to this time fight the other guards for entertainment. In 1944, a camp capo wanted to prove himself against the now emaciated and malnutritioned, enslaved former champion. But even in his worn-out, starving form, Rukeli still managed to beat the camp capo, only to be rewarded with a shovel to the head, making this his last fight. The Romani were deemed to have alien blood under Germany's Nuremberg laws and suffered under the same genocidal system as the Jewish folks and other minorities. From the data that we have, we know that about 70% of German, 80% of Austrian, 90% of Czech Romani perished at the hands of so-called Greater Germany. And as for the territories occupied by Germany, Poland lost 45%, Ukraine lost 75%, Estonia lost 90%, and Latvia lost 60%, and the remaining Soviet Union lost 35% of their Romani populations as a direct result of targeted hunting and persecution. The first internment camps for Romani were set up as early as 1935. Hundreds of Romani were sent to concentration camps like Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and Dachau. This happened during the German government's campaigns to round up the work-shy and antisocial in 1937 and 1938. The assigned triangle to be worn by Roma and Sinti people was the Brown Triangle. At the end of 1942, Heinrich Himmler ordered that all Romani in German territories be sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. For the Nazi scientist Josef Mengele, the relatively young population of the G-word family camp were his preferred subjects for experimentation. Romani men and women were subjected to new experimental drugs and procedures, including new methods of sterilization, all in pursuit to find new and more efficient ways to sterilize non-white populations and those considered racially undesirable. This is also reminiscent of the way in which the British Army viewed the bodies of British Indian soldiers as suitable for experimentation. Before and during World War II, British scientists from the Portendown Chemical Warfare Establishment in Wiltshire had been posted to a military facility in Rawalpindi in modern-day Pakistan. Portendown was the first ever chemical warfare facility in the world, and it was opened by the British in 1916. British scientists had been sending hundreds upon hundreds of brown bodies into gas chambers to be exposed to mustard gas for the sake of designing chemical weapons. Between 1916 and 1989, at least 20,000 Indian soldiers were subjected to experimental chemical weapons involving poison gas, nerve gas, and mustard gas. The gas chambers weren't even the primary way in which the Germans wiped out the Romani populations. On the Eastern Front, Romani were actively hunted down by Einsatzgruppen, the death squads that accompanied the German army, whose main role was to execute Roma, Jews, and communists. In 1944, when Auschwitz-Birkenau was preparing to receive 400,000 Hungarian Jews. As part of the camp's preparation, Rudolf Hess ordered that the Roma be cleared out to make room. According to Jennifer Putnam, the first group of Roma to be liquidated was the Russian Roma. The remaining survivors in Camp Birkenau realized that they were not safe, and they decided to arm themselves and prepare. They gathered whatever they could: shovels, hammers, pickaxes, and prepared to fight. The next day, on May 15th, 1944, 50 to 60 SS officers arrived with machine guns and German shepherds. An SS Obersturmführer, Johann Schwarzhuber, led his men from block to block, banging on doors, but everyone inside stayed still. The lights of Camp Birkenau were lit up, and the SS officers realized that the Romani were ready to fight. Unprepared for a full-scale rebellion, the SS officers returned to their trucks and drove off. However, they returned a week later, but this time to select young, fit individuals who were fit for forced labor, whom they could transfer out. Over the following months, more women and children would be whisked away to be experimented on by Josef Mengele, and the able-bodied boys were taken to labor camps. Many would die due to disease and abuse. Finally, in August 1st, 1944, over 1,400 prisoners were transferred out for manual labor, leaving just the elderly and young children. And on August 2nd, 1944, the SS officers returned once more with machine guns and German shepherds. The remaining elderly and children fought for their lives the whole night until all of them were taken to the gas chambers. The SS searched the camp to find anyone who'd escaped their grasp. In the kindergarten, they found Helena Hahnemann, a German woman who'd married a Romani man. She had been imprisoned with her husband and 5 children. When the German soldiers found her, they gave her a choice: to hand over her 5 children or go to the gas chambers with them. She chose to die with her children. This next story came to mind when I watched a documentary on the slow and callous sterilization of Romani women in Slovakia. Healthcare professionals in parts of Europe, even today, segregate Roma from white patients. Many healthcare professionals also hold deeply rooted, deterministic racial prejudice towards their Romani patients. Just watch how these doctors and nurses talk about their Roma patients.
Z tých osád prichádzajú, sú veľmi zaostalí po stránke hygienickej, po stránke sociálnej, kultúrnej, psychickej a v tom zmysle. Z mesta, čo idú, sa vyrovnajú bielým, ale tam sú v komunitách, nemajú záujem o nič. Oni žijú v tej komunite, nechodia do školy, hygienické návyky, nemajú základné hygienické.
No to už jak detsko sa tlačilo na svet počas bolesti, vtedy sa mi otočil chrbtom, začal sa vyškierať a hovoril, že fuj, cigánka smrdavá. On sa ma vôbec ani nechcel dotýkať.
Rómske pacientky z tých osad, tak vám poviem, že to je zdegenerovaná rasa. Deti plodia čím ďalej, tým viacej z tej finančnej stránky, že mali proste ako...
Riešenia pre tie Rómky, pre ich starostlivosť, že vlastne parodili nejaké zdravšie deti.
Lepší prístup a zodpovednosť a ten materinský cit, ktorý majú v sebe, to ja neviem. Materinský cit, aby v nich sa konečne prebudil a že by...
I think the first thing to do is to admit that the fundamental problem here is that we've got nurses and doctors who don't think that Roma are human beings. Apparently they don't think that Roma are even mammals. Is there a mammal that lacks maternal instincts? I don't think we should try to address the problem by looking too deeply at the Romani community. I think we need to start by asking what can we do about the fact that a hospital is staffed by people that think that non-whites lack basic human characteristics like a love for one's own children. Most Slovaks, including those that I would call left of center politically, including those who I think are very intelligent and open-minded, including lots of different types of people, pretty much all seem to believe that Roma are culturally inferior, that Roma don't respect work as much as whites, that Roma don't believe in education the way whites do. By the way, if this doesn't go without saying, I think all this is false and it is dumb bigotry, but for the Slovaks, this doesn't go without saying.
The story of Holocaust survivor Alfreda Markowska was the one that came to mind when I saw this scene. Also known as Babcia Noncia, she took it upon herself to save as many children as she could who were on their way to concentration camps. Today we have the accounts of 50 children who were Jewish, Roma, Polish and German who made it to adulthood thanks to her. Noncia's heroic deeds were finally recognized by the Polish president in 2006 when they awarded her the Commander's Cross with the Star of the Order of Polonia, which is the second highest civilian award. During World War II, Noncia had been out in the village fetching groceries when she was warned by a local woman to not go back to where her tabor or convoy had been set up. Noncia hid in the local woman's barn instead. She later found out that her entire camp was found and murdered by a German contingent, leaving her as the sole survivor. She later traveled to Rosvadau, where she met and married another survivor of a German pogrom on a Romani tabor. They were caught in a street roundup by the Germans and were imprisoned in the Lourdes and Lublin ghettos. However, they managed a daring escape and actually made it back to Rosvadau. They joined a German labor camp for Romani so that they could get passes. They were assigned to work on the railroads, and with the new work permits they had freedom of movement. The freedom of movement given by this piece of paper would be what Noncia would exploit to save the lives of countless children. Death was the punishment for any person hiding minorities in Poland. Noncia figured that she was probably going to be killed anyway and likened her survival as the only survivor of her tabor to some sort of divine purpose. So she resolved to save as many children as she could. Noncia's main duty assigned by the Germans was to carry water to trains transporting Jews and Romani who was being sent to concentration camps. When walking through the wagons distributing water, Noncia would sometimes come across a lone babe who she would be able to hide beneath the layers of her traditional Roma dress. A piece of clothing, by the way, that is illegal to wear when shopping in some stores in Europe. These are no G-word signs in the US from 2023 outside a few gas stations in LA County. If the child was a bit older, Noncia would give the child the bucket of water to hold and walk through the wagons and distribute water with her, after which they'd walk out of the wagons right in front of the German officers. Noncia would then bring the children to a pre-arranged location and hand them off to a contact who would assign them a family to live with. A trusted individual would pick them up and assign them to a trusted family. Besides saving children while on railway duty, Noncia would also volunteer to go to massacre sites, where she would then search for survivors, especially children. She would often pull them out from underneath the bodies of their mothers or other siblings. She would raise many of these children in her own home. Babcia Noncia actually lived to the age of 94 and passed away only recently in 2021. These are shameful things you don't hear much about because many folks like to believe that things like this only happened in the past. I hope you've learned something today. These videos are purely educational and only meant to highlight some issues that are rarely heard about in the mainstream. As I've always said, we gain nothing by monolithizing any of our neighbors. It only benefits corporations looking to profit off our misery and politicians who are looking to farm votes. For the rest of us, it only brings misery. That alone should get one to think that we should be leading with love. Thanks for watching.